Hello, welcome everyone. I'm Sarah Cahill. I'm one of the co-founders of Migraine Foundation Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm delighted to welcome you all here this morning. For those of you who may not be familiar with our charity, Migraine Foundation Aotearoa, New Zealand was founded by myself, Fiona Imlark and Suzanne Vale in 2022. Fiona, Suzanne and I all live with migraine. Prior to 2022, I'd connected with Fiona and Suzanne separately, thanks in part to my migraine blog I began writing in 2020. I was writing a blog as a way to share with others what I'd been learning about migraine and also to try and connect with others in New Zealand with migraine. When better attempting to understand and manage my own condition, I realised there was no real migraine voice in New Zealand. No charity, no support group, not much New Zealand specific information. Basically, I felt quite on my own, yet I knew there were so many others in New Zealand with migraine facing similar challenges. During this time, I also became involved in migraine advocacy overseas, volunteering as the co-lead of the Migraine World Summit copywriting team, and I realised the urgent need for migraine advocacy in New Zealand. Fiona and I connected first. Fiona was about to embark on her 5-month journey walking the 3,000-kilometre Te Aotearoa Trail from the top of the North Island to the bottom of the South Island. Fiona found my blog and thought I'd be interested in a blog she was writing in the lead up to Te Aotearoa. Her blog, aptly named Tramping with Migraine, was to document her experience of getting away from the daily grind of life, computer screens and daily stresses, and just, well, walking every day. She was keen to find out if constantly walking would help ease her migraine attacks, make her attacks worse, or not make any difference. Of course, I was a hooked reader. I think I was selfishly hoping walking 3,000 kilometres wasn't going to be the secret sauce to no more migraine attacks. I'm not sure I could find time to walk for 8 hours a day for the rest of my life. And if that cure-all was a scary thought for me, what about these migraine researchers and migraine experts we have here today? If it was that simple, they'd be out of a career. Mountain guides and personal trainers might be the winners though. Suzanne and I met during 2021. Suzanne, a native Australian, had moved to New Zealand during 2020 and having been involved as a volunteer for Migraine and Headache Australia, was looking for a similar charity, migraine charity to support in New Zealand. A quick Google search led her not to any migraine charity because one did not exist, but to me and my blog. After some shared concerns about the migraine landscape in New Zealand, the three of us decided that if anything was to improve in New Zealand, perhaps we needed to be the ones to start the momentum. So, blindly and naively, we decided to give this migraine charity thing a go and see where it led us. Frankly, it led us down a rabbit hole of the sheer scale of issues needing to be addressed about migraine in New Zealand. But it also led us to connect with some incredible people, including health professionals with a shared passion to improve migraine care in New Zealand. And also our ever-expanding migraine community, including many of you with you here in person and online today. Fiona and I both come from a health background. Myself as a registered nurse for 14 years before making the career switch to a medical writer. Fiona is a public health physician with a PhD in epidemiology and now working as a researcher, and Suzanne is a lawyer. We're fortunate to be supported by a collective of incredible people. As well as some regular volunteers, we're supported by our clinical advisory board, consisting of 3 neurologists, Dr. Rosamund Hill, Dr. Ray Bose and Dr. Desiree Fernandez, together with Dr. Paul Verrope, specialist pain medicine physician and child, adolescent and adult consult liaison psychiatrist, Dr. Jonathan Kennedy, a GP, and pharmacist Belinda Robinson. Plus others such as Professor Debbie Hay and Dr. Calvin Chan have continued to support our work and work with us over the past few years. Nearly 3 years on, we continue to all work as volunteers. I'm incredibly proud of what we've achieved so far as we juggle our jobs, which have potentially taken a bit of a backseat, families, life in general, and of course, life with migraine. Our website, which I encourage you to check out if you haven't already, has a lot of information about what we've done, plus a big donate now button, and what we're working on. But a few key achievements since 2022 include: we successfully advocated for 3 CGRP medications to be added to Pharmac's options for investment list, which is Pharmac's medication funding wish list. This began with our application to Pharmac to fund Emgality way back in November 2022, and engaging with Pharmac continues to be one of our priorities. We're steadfast in our resolve that everyone with migraine in New Zealand should have access to the most appropriate migraine-specific medication, not just those who can afford it. We conducted our Migraine in Aotearoa New Zealand survey in 2022. This was the first survey to ask people in New Zealand about migraine. We'd only been a charity for a few months, so we were thrilled to have 530 completed submissions. This data has been crucial to our advocacy efforts. We've published 3 articles in New Zealand medical journals, published 23 key insight reports on our website, and the research has led to ongoing media attention, which we know is vital for raising awareness about the true impact migraine has on our lives. In 2022, we also made a submission to the Ministry of Health to include migraine questions in the 2023-24 New Zealand Health Survey, and were rewarded with success. The data we will get from this survey, plus our own survey data, means we finally have some up-to-date and relevant information about migraine in New Zealand. We continue to educate our migraine community through our website and online resources. We've held support group meetings, we send out a free monthly newsletter, we've held in-person events, we've had education webinars, we published topical latest news articles, we've submitted an abundance of official information Act requests, connected with GPs at conferences and through the development of our GP resources. Support, information, research, and advocacy and awareness are the key pillars that guide everything we do. We have some big goals for 2025. We're incredibly grateful to our migraine community for supporting us on this journey, and we're delighted so many of you have joined us in person and online today. Now, on to what you've come here for. Today's event couldn't be possible without the support from Rich and his team at the Neurological Foundation. Thank you for partnering with us and bringing this event to life. And thank you to AbbVie, who have provided sponsorship for this event. Thank you to Professor Peter Goadsby, Professor Debbie Hay, and Dr. Calvin Chan for being here with us today in what is a first for our migraine community. Professor Goadsby and Professor Hay are both flying out on international flights this afternoon, so we're grateful they can be here with us this morning. I'll now hand you over to Fiona, who will introduce our speakers and the format for the morning. Before I do, like any good hosts, I need, of course, to mention the toilets. They're located out the door behind you and to the right. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Before I introduce our guest speakers, just a couple of things. During registration, you all had the opportunity to submit a question. We had an overwhelming response. I had pages of questions. We're not going to be able to get them through them all, but still really keen to know what sort of things that you like to hear about. And it does show how much need and interest there is for this type of event. So we'll aim to cover as many of the questions as possible in the 2 Q&A sessions, but you can see around the room here, if you're in person, there's a QR code. If you have any questions that come to mind during the presentations, you can scan those and put in a question for that. Sarah or Emmanuel, see Sarah if you have any issues with that. That will take you through to the question page. If you're online, please just put in any questions into the chat function and we will monitor those also as they come through. So I'm delighted to introduce today's speakers. First off, Professor Peter Goadsby. Professor Goadsby is an Australian neuroscientist and physician based at King's College London. He's the director of the National Institute for Health Research, the Wellcome Trust King Clinical Research, and his research focuses on the mechanisms of primary headache disorders, particularly migraine. Professor Goadsby was co-recipient of the 2021 Brain Prize, the world's largest brain research award, for his work on the mechanisms and treatment of migraine disease. And he really is the father of the CGRP treatments that we've all come to see as the new wave of migraine treatment. It's the discovery of the calcitonin gene-related peptide, or CGRP, has paved the way for the development of these new treatments. So Professor Goadsby will be talking about what the research reveals about the nature of migraine disease, and he will be followed by Professor Debbie Hay. So Professor Hay is a researcher at Aotearoa University in Dunedin, and she leads a laboratory focusing on G protein-coupled receptors, which are the target of their new drugs designed to treat migraine. Professor Hay obtained her BSc in pharmacology from Sheffield University, followed by her PhD from Imperial College London. She's the editorial board member of the British Journal of Pharmacology, and she's a member of this very long named committee which classifies drugs and receptors. So she chairs the subcommittee on the CGRP receptors. So I have to say, Debbie is a big shot in the world of CGRP research, and we're so lucky and grateful to have her working here in New Zealand. So Professor will present about the new wave of migraine medications. These two presentations will be followed by about a 30-minute Q&A session. We'll then break for about 25 minutes for tea, coffee, and morning tea outside. For those of you online, we'll be reconvening at about 11:25. In the second session, Michaela Lyon, who is the Head of Market Access and Government Affairs at AbbVie, will provide a brief update regarding migraine treatments in New Zealand, focusing on atogepant and Botox. So AbbVie is a pharmaceutical company that makes atogepant, or Equipta, which is the latest medication targeting CGRP that is available in New Zealand, and we will be hearing more about this during the day. Our final session is with Dr. Calvin Chan. Dr. Chan will spend some time talking about migraine management in New Zealand, what are some of the non-medication options for managing migraine, and how can we manage with what we have available in New Zealand. Dr. Chan's a consultant neurologist and headache specialist at Palmerston North Hospital. He attained his medical degree from Otago University, worked in hospitals in Auckland, Waikato and Palmerston North, and then completed a fellowship with Professor Goadsby at King's College in London. On his return to New Zealand, he sat on the Council of the Australian New Zealand Headache Society, and he was instrumental in bringing Professor Hay and Professor Goadsby to speak at the annual meeting of the Neurological Association of New Zealand this week, which has meant that we can have this event today. And then after Calvin, we will have a 30-minute Q&A session with Peter and Calvin to follow up on some other questions about managing migraine in New Zealand and the standard of headache care. I personally feel as if all of these speakers have had a positive impact on my life. The research from Peter and Debbie has led to the development of these new migraine medicines, which have been the only preventive medicines which have worked for me. And Calvin was the neurologist that first prescribed one of these for me. So I'm very grateful for the improvement this has made on my life. I'm very grateful for your work and your research, all of you. And we want more people in New Zealand to know about and be able to access the best treatments and to understand more about the nature of migraine disease. So to do that, please welcome Professor Peter Goadsby.
Thanks. Oh, thanks. Nice to be here. Thanks for asking me to speak. A bit like headache researchers talking to patient groups is a bit like reporting to the schoolmaster, so to speak, or teacher. You might think of it the other way, probably, but it is that way, really. You should think of it that way, because our purpose is to deal with your problems, not create. Unfortunately, sometimes we meaning that, I hope not me, but broadly speaking, sometimes make things worse. I was asked to talk about what research reveals about the nature of migraine. I'm going to cover some things. Here we are. So I'll keep an eye on the time. I don't use the term migraine disease. I think it's a tautology. I'm sorry. I realise it's politically correct. I have no interest in political correctness at all. I never have. It's a signature of my career, because I think migraine is a disease and that's the end of it. And so the rest of it, I wouldn't add more words, but that's a personal opinion. You're welcome to say whatever you like. So migraine's one of these are the headache disorders from something called the International Classification of Headache Disorders. It's free on the International Headache Society's website. It's a romping good 160-page read, a 200-page read, bedtime read, most of which probably wouldn't interest you. And the way we think about headache disorders is to think about them in terms of whether they're primary or secondary. I realise some of what I'm going to say, there'll be people online or some people in the room who know it all, know what I'm going to say at any rate, and that's the purpose of the questions. So if some of what I say seems a little simplistic, then just bear with us till the questions. I thought I'd sort of start with some level setting. We think of, there are a collection of diseases that are described as primary headache disorders, where the headache is part of a collection of symptoms that is there without any external effect, you might say. If I contrast that to the secondary headache disorders, the obvious one there was just trauma to the head. So if someone comes along and hits you with a stick in the head, big stick, you'll get pain in the head. It's a secondary headache. If you have a tumour or an infection, you get pain in the head for various reasons. While that's important, and many of my colleagues are very excited by it, I'm not particularly interested because it's sort of obvious if you belt someone in the head, they're going to have a sore head, so what? Primary headache disorders are really quite interesting if you think about them. I realise if you've got it, it's interesting may not be the word, but because you get the problem without any particularly good reason for it, if I could say it that way. There's nothing obvious going on. That's why they're called primary. And the number one of the primary headache disorders in the ICHD is migraine, because that's the commonest cause of disability in the world due to a headache disorder. That wasn't known when the system got set up in the 1980s, actually. I think it was fortuitous. The other ones I'm not going to talk about, although I'd be happy to talk about any of them, really. Tension-type headache is, I don't know anyone I respect who can put a evidence-based sentence together on the subject of tension-type headache. I think it's just a mess. And part of the reason is the way the classification has messed it up. There are other forms of headache. I'm quite interested in cluster headache. I don't know if anyone is online who has cluster. There'll be cluster headache patients somewhere in New Zealand, I can almost guarantee it. And there are cluster headache groups throughout the world. I'd be happy to talk about any of these conditions. You can see that by the time we got to section 4, the classification committee had had a complete lack of creativity, and we just called everything else other, which is a little unhelpful in many ways. Most of that is fairly obvious. If you have headache when you cough, it's called cough headache. It's not quite right. It's called Valsalva. It's Valsalva manoeuvres. That's like coughing or lifting like that, any sort of strain, unless you're sort of going under section 4.3, where we very specifically call that out as a sexual activity headache, for fairly obvious reasons, I suppose. And there are two forms of that, and I can talk about that in as much detail as you can tolerate. It has to be said. I've run into some patients over the years who've described lots of interesting things to me around that. They're mutually exclusive, cough headache and sex headache, interesting enough. You can get headache from exercise, just a featureless headache from exercise, but it doesn't count if you're exercising in section 4.3. Thunderclap headache comes on like that. Cold stimulus headache is what happens when you walk outside today, I guess. That's a bit cool. You get cold, or if you stick something cold in your mouth. The Americans call it ice cream headache. External compression headache is if you put a band around your head and you tighten it. It's not clear why you would want to do that, but that's a recognised thing, and the treatment is very effective. You loosen the band. You do very well, that has to be said. I wonder why we put this in here. Stabbing headache are just stabs like that. Many of you who have migraine will also have, from time to time, sudden stabs or jabs in the head, comes out of nowhere. Don't know why it happens. It can be really awfully painful and it's gone. It's called primary stabbing headache. Nummular headache is headache that looks like it's coin-shaped. And hypnic headache is headache that happens when you go to sleep. And eudatic persistent headache starts from one day to the next. I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about migraine. The classification is actually quite useful. I'll come to the criteria in a second, but it's widely used. I mean actually better to say globally used, because all of the authorities that are involved in regulating medicines or regulating healthcare everywhere in the world use the same classification, being translated into 30-odd languages. It's the People's Republic of China and Taiwan both use that classification. The Ukrainians and the Russians both use that classification. The people in Israel, Lebanon, and Palestine, if I may use that term, all use that classification. We've done better in headache than most governments have done in terms of getting sort of general agreement. And that means that the work that's done anywhere in the world, you can understand how it can be applied in other parts of the world, because we've standardised the way that we do the studies. And that's actually extremely useful. It means that studies that are done, for example, in North America or in the Czech Republic, in the generality of things, are as useful in Auckland as they are in Prague. And that's important. It also means you're not alone. There's 1 billion or more of you. Frightening number when you think about it. I noticed if there's 1 million people affected by neurologic disorders in this country, 3/4 of them must be migraine by my calculation. So you guys win but it's not something you want to win, I'm going to guess. So I wanted to say a few things about one of the things we've begun to understand very well is the broader nature of the attack, is the way I probably want to say this. So on the left, I have a description of a migraine attack. Well, I had the things that happen in a migraine attack, a laundry list of things that happen in a migraine attack. And on the right, I have some things about migraine, you might say the disease or the disorder, because people with migraine have migraine. Migraine is the disorder of having migraine, so to speak. The word's used in two ways. And just because all your attacks every day aren't typically migraine doesn't mean you got new parents. Your biology doesn't change more or less on a day-to-day basis. We use some definitions which don't make a lot of sense, don't make any sense to me, and I was involved in deriving them, I can tell you. This business of episodic and chronic migraine, if you wonder where we got 15 from, it's half of 30. That's it. That is it. It's the only thing the committee could agree on. It's half of 30. It's really embarrassing. As I've said before many times, the only guy who had any brains in the room, I suspect, was the German chap, Christoph Diener, who asked what we were going to do with February. And we haven't managed to answer that question in 20 years. It's embarrassing. I think it's a useless terminology, but actually the reason that it's come to capture us is because governments, rightly or wrongly, governments believe this classification system, and so governments will very often insist on data for episodic and chronic migraine and prescription for episodic and chronic migraine. So if you wonder where it comes from, it doesn't make any sense, but you have to, sometimes you've got to live with the rules, you know. If you're going to play tennis, you've got to hit the ball over the net, it's got to get in with the lines. You can't argue with the umpire. You can try, but you'll always lose. So it is what it is. Just live with it. Family history is important in migraine. Most people who have migraine will have a first-degree relative, mother, father, brother or sister, someone in the family who'll have migraine. And, you know, if one of the parents don't have migraine, a good place to look for the culprit would be dad's mum, because males manifest the disorder much less than females do. So you can sometimes trace it through dad's mum. Fundamentally, migraine is a disorder that's almost certainly inherited in some way. We've done very badly at sorting out the genetics of that, very badly. We've got lots of things that point in various directions, more than 100 of them, but really haven't sorted that out in any useful fashion. That said, we think that's where the disorder starts in most people. I'm going to say some specific things about triggering, because very often people are asking about triggering. These are some of the things that are triggers, you might say, and they speak to what the sort of lifestyle advice that we generally give, which I suggest people need regular sleep, regular meals and regular exercise, and I try to ignore that advice myself as much as I possibly can, although recently I've been better at doing regular exercise. Alcohol will trigger migraine, nitroglycerin will trigger migraine. Weather's a funny thing, we don't really understand that, and I'm going to come back to some of these other so-called triggers. Certainly variations in the menstrual cycle will trigger migraine. We understand that reasonably well in terms of hormonal change, although that's vastly under-researched, I think. So if I go to the other side, we spend a lot of time on what are called the canonical symptoms. These are the symptoms that are used for clinical trials. So the pain of migraine should be one-sided, should be pounding or throbbing, and it should be worsened with physical activity. Most people with migraine will not get up and run about the countryside or beat their head against the wall. They won't do that. That's a bad idea. 90% rule. An important rule about migraine is there is no absolute rule. All of these things vary. It's what's called syndromic. So you can have bits of it. I see plenty of people with headache on both sides of their head that doesn't throb but is aggravated by movement, for example. And I'm quite happy to call it migraine. The other thing that you should have, although obviously this is not what you want to have, but from a clinical perspective is what you do have, is nausea. Some people get a bonus, they vomit, lucky them. Luckily, that's not the majority. And then there's these what are called sensory sensitivities, which are at the core of migraine and really differentiated from tension type headache. So light sensitivity, sound sensitivity, it's called phonophobia, light's called photophobia. Smell sensitivity, I graded out because it's not in the ICHD classification. That's probably a mistake. It's quite specific to migraine, so sensitive to smells. Sensitive to light touch, something called allodynia, pain, discomfort from a non-painful stimulus. So those of you who normally, I'd say hair, but I'm trying to find where my hair is. It's a little bit back here. Those of you who might have pain from brushing the hair when you have an attack, that's called allodynia. And then there's dizziness. Vertigo, the illusory sense of movement, which is very common in migraines. Probably half of people who have migraine will have some sense of this. And very often we'll describe that as vestibular migraine. I'm not sure that's a wonderful term, but it's a popular term and it helps the ENT folks focus. The message in migraine is that migraine is a disorder of the way the brain deals with its environment, deals with incoming information. That's why it's complex, because all of the senses, light, touch, sound, smell, sound, they're all affected at some level and variously. And we haven't understood why some people, for example, would need to wear dark glasses all the time, and some people, light doesn't bother them at all. It's extraordinary, the variability. Before the attack comes, you can start to get sensations of it, often days beforehand, sometimes just hours beforehand, where you don't feel quite right and maybe you're off your game a bit, you can't quite concentrate. Maybe you feel fatigued or you want to sleep, you yawn. If you yawn, about 90% chance you'll go on and have a migraine. It's a very reliable, what's called premonitory or prodromal symptom. You might pass more urine. It's not the sort of question neurologists usually ask. You know, it's one of the reasons I got into neurology, because you don't have to deal with any of the, downstairs stuff, so to speak. But passing more urine is a common premonitory symptom. Food cravings, I think that accounts for some of this food trigger nonsense. People take some food and they get their attack, and it's more of a triggering thing. And some people with migraine will have some sniffliness or eye watering, a bit of tearing, and I feel a bit flushed. They're called cranial autonomic symptoms, and they very often, in many places, will lead to ENT people or people thinking they've got allergies and sticking stuff up their nose and so forth, for which no particular useful thing will come. One of the frustrations, I suspect, that very often people with migraine will talk about is this idea, you go to a neurologist, if you can find one. I'm told that's a bit of a problem in New Zealand. It's a problem all over the world, it has to be said. Either you find one you don't like or you can't find one at all. There doesn't seem to be any happy balance in that. And the neurologist might examine you and tell you that you're normal. Well, you probably don't feel normal when you have an attack. It's a sort of word that we bandy about. Then you might get a brain scan and they'll cheerfully tell you that your brain scan is normal. You shouldn't be disappointed by that, because in neurology, if your brain scan's not normal, that's bad. One of two things will happen. Either you've got something growing, in which case you want to get on a boat, take a trip, enjoy what you've got left, or you'll have some sort of brain rot for which there's no treatment altogether. So having a normal scan might seem like a bad idea, but I can tell you it's a good idea, a really, really good idea. Now, the frustration is that these scans that we do are structural. It's like looking at a car. Look at, say, a Ferrari out the front, and it looks quite cool, but if it's got no petrol, it's not going anywhere. It's not functioning at all. And the problem with migraine is not that the structure's wrong, but the way it works. It doesn't work properly, if I can say it that way. And functional imaging, which is these examples of, have been very good, I think, to migraine in this regard, where we've been able to trigger attacks with nitroglycerin. 4 out of 5 people with migraine will have their attack triggered if you infuse something called nitroglycerin. It's usually used for cardiac heart problems. And you can then have the person in the scan, and you can see what their brain is doing differently compared to people who you give nitroglycerin to who don't get migraine. And at the top there, the top 3 scans were done with a radioactive tracer called 15 labelled water. It's a positron tracer. And what it shows is little blobs in the brain, and they're little blobs of areas that are behaving in a way that the control scan is not. They're the consequence of the function change that's happening in the earliest part of the attack. And you can see it, and it's quite reproducible. This is the first of the things that were done. Farouk Maniar, when we were in San Francisco, led on this. Others have done the same sort of scanning, and it's quite in different ways, and come to the same sort of conclusions, that these areas of the brain are quite robust. So it's not that when people do a scan that if there's nothing going on in your brain, it's simply they don't see it with static imaging, and you can't do it. We don't have a good enough resolution of these scans yet to be able to do it on a single basis. So you need maybe, for a PET, you need half a dozen people to be 6 to 8 participants to be able to show what's going on. But rest assured, it's crystal clear, and it's reproduced many times over, that when something's happening in your migraine, there are things that are going on in your brain. Now, happily, the hypothalamus is an area that is involved in controlling many things. It has influences into something called the limbic system, mood. It has influences on passing urine. It has influence on food triggering. It has influences on pain. It has influences on circadian rhythm, which is involved in sleep. And sleep problems can be such a torture for people with migraine. So these areas of the brain that are active make sense in terms of the type of symptoms that you have, and you could be. It's not that, I mean, I shouldn't have to say this to you. It's not like you make them up. Not crazy people. They're just difficult to. They're just being difficult to capture. At the bottom scans with the red ones, nausea, CARS, and this is work we've done at King's using something called arterial spin labelling. It's an MR technique, so it doesn't have radiation, so you can do many scans over. And we were interested in the very relatively simple question of, if you have a preventive, does that change the way the brain responds to these triggers? And the answer, unsurprisingly, perhaps, is yes, it does. So you can manipulate that. You could start to get a biomarker, if you like, a way of measuring something when a person is on a preventive. Now, I want to say something specific about triggering, and I'll use this as an example. These are two studies published by Farouk when we were in San Francisco. The one on the and what we did was take people who we could trigger their attacks, and we could look at their symptoms in the premonitory phase. That's before you get pain, because the problem with pain, I understand it's unpleasant, but the problem with pain, sort of intellectually and from a research perspective, is it influences so many things. It sort of messes scans up a little bit. So it's quite helpful to be able to look at things happening in the brain without the problem of having pain. And on the left is, and these are all comparisons. So what we did was take people who we triggered and had their premonitory symptoms, and some of them would have nausea before the pain, and some wouldn't. And you subtract the 2 scans and you ask yourself the question, what's the difference in their brain? And the little blob at the bottom on the left-hand scan is an area of the brain that's involved, unsurprisingly, in throwing up and nausea, because these people had nausea. It's not all that surprising, although it's quite reassuring that if you say you're nauseated and you do this type of scanning, you can show parts of the brain that we know to already be involved in nausea. On the right-hand side is the same thing but done with light. So what we did was subtract the scans and show there's the back of the brain there where that little yellow part is on the right-hand blob is the vision area, the visual cortex. So it's not entirely surprising that if someone's got light sensitivity that their visual cortex is overactive. But it goes to show you that it's not like a construct you just dream up or some nonsense idea. It's very, very concrete if you can get the right technology to measure it. And it has an implication, I think, and it's a broad implication, and it's in the middle panel of this. It's the business of triggers versus premonitory symptoms. I don't think for a moment what I'm about to say is an explanation for all triggers, but I do think it's an explanation for some things. One of the things we're interested in is asking people, okay, tell me what triggers your migraine. Many will say light. Light's a trigger. Bright lights are a trigger. And then you talk about the actual attack just before the attack. Tell me about your premonitory symptoms. Light sensitivity is very common. And in this study, about 3/4 said both. And I'll put it to you that what sometimes is regarded as a trigger is simply the premonitory symptom before the headache. So if you're sensitive to light and then 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hours later you get a headache, you might think, oh, well, you notice the light, you get a headache, you notice the light, you get a headache, you notice the light, you get a headache. You do that 500 times, you think, well, okay, light must be triggering a headache. Unless you realise that the attack could be already started and you could be noticing lights and sensitive to light and so on, because actually your attack starts long before the headache starts in this thing called the premonitory phase. And I think it accounts for some of the frustration, say with food triggering, where people will notice something. Chocolate's the classic one where this has happened. And what's happening is they're being driven by parts of the brain that are quite primitive, and I don't mean that you're primitive people, but there are parts of the brain that look after things like when you need to eat, when you need to pass urine, drive you to sleep, and so all drive your heart to make sure it keeps going. So all of that stuff we evolved over many, many years. And when they don't work properly, then they drive you to do things that you don't really need to do as such. I'll say a few words about understanding of migraine aura, because that's that little thing that's happening is what's called a cortical spreading depression in a brain. It's a cat brain, actually. One of my colleagues, Andy Parsons, gave me that a long time ago. So people who have aura have this flashing, most of them, 90%, have this little flashing twiggly thing, usually straight lines, off in the periphery and it grows, and sometimes it leaves some of the vision black behind it. And that can be imaged quite clearly. It was first imaged in the 1980s by Olson on the left-hand side in that coloured panel, showing changes in brain blood flow that are happening in the vision part of the brain and moving across the brain. And you can do other sorts of fancy things. Hajikani and Moskowitz did this with something called functional imaging using bold imaging to do it. It's quite clear that phenomenon of visual aura, again, can be imaged and then can be taken into experimental animals to be better understood. One last thing I want to say is about how to understand pain a little bit. There's just the structure of pain. So one of the interesting things about the brain is it's largely insensate. You can poke around in it as the surgeons do, and they don't poke around meaninglessly, of course, they're poking around very carefully, but it doesn't cause pain. What's painful in the head is the covering of the brain. It's called the dura, and if you tug on it, as surgeons do from time to time, sometimes when they're doing operations, they'll be removing a tumour and they'll open the head up under local anaesthetic, and then they'll be removing the tumour, and they need to know that they're not causing any trouble, so they get a person to speak or move their hand and so forth, so you're actually conscious. And if you tug on the dura mater, this covering, then people will say it's painful or uncomfortable, but they won't say you're tugging on my dura. You've got no word for that. You don't even know what that's not a thing. What everyone does is refer the pain out. So if you're tugging on the top of the dura, they'll talk about the pain being out here in what's called the trigeminal distribution. It's what's called referred pain, because there's no point knowing your dura is being tugged on, because normally you don't have your skull open, you can't do anything about it. It's a warning system. The back of the information from the back does the same sort of thing in the brain. They both go to the same place in the brain. It's called the trigeminocervical complex. And the reason that sometimes it's a bit vague, or it changes around or moves here or moves here, is because the purpose of this system is to tell you something bad's happening in your head. The purpose is not to go and do something to any particular place. It's the problem of referred pain. It's warning. It has no useful, immediate, functional consequence. So sometimes feels a bit, I tell my colleagues, if someone's telling you about their pain and it sounds a little vague what they're describing, what they're doing is talking to you about activation of cells in the brain, their pathways in the brain. They're telling you about something really very complex. And that's why it sounds woolly, because the descriptions that we have are limited because of the purpose of the exercise. Last thing I want to show you is a little bit complex, but it's to a purpose. If you look at this, we've got good imaging now for the premonitory or prodromal phase. I went through a couple of those things. We have good imaging of when people have pain, the structures that are involved when you have pain. I mean functional imaging. We've got very good imaging of what's happening in the aura phase. We haven't really done well imaging the postdrome yet, but that's a work in progress. And we've understood that these various parts of a migraine attack are networked and integrated. So there are rules, but like any good human pastime, the rules can sometimes be ignored and broken because of the way these networks work. We've been fortunate in the last 30 years to have acute treatments, triptans and these GPANs and monoclonal antibodies that target CGRP. There are nerve modulation methods called neuromodulation that avoid drugs altogether, that are available and work, and there are drugs that don't have constriction, and the next big thing is going to be something called PACAP, or pituitary adenylate cyclase activating polypeptide. We're trying to make the names longer. Why not? But the first of the randomised controlled trials for that has just been reported. So if you've had everything, you haven't had everything yet. Which is cool. And then there are things that are people that are going along in the science. And from time to time, something really cool happens, like the CGRP story, and then lots of stuff goes on behind the science. You should never imagine that there's no one interested in migraine. There aren't enough people interested in it, that's certainly true. But you should never imagine that there's not. There are people beavering away in laboratories about some of these other things called glurants and rexants and Mambalgians, the things that will eventually either come or not come, and some of them will come. You shouldn't think when you have your next attack that there's never going to be any way forward, because there will be. And you shouldn't think that no one believes you've got the condition or think you're crazy people, because we do, and we can image it, and it's crystal clear. And lastly, if some of my colleagues sometimes have been a bit of a pain in the arse about it and not treated you very well, I apologise. We should do better. We don't have any right as physicians to stigmatise your condition just because we don't understand it. And so bear with the clowns, because there are people who are really interested in the problem who want to make your life better. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Peter. I love the hope that you give us, and I love the acknowledgement of many of us have not had the best experiences, so thank you very much. Debbie, please. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou. It's my absolute pleasure to be with you here this morning to talk about the new wave of migraine medications. So what am I talking about? Well, this is the wave that I'm talking about, the CGRP pathway wave. We've now got this flurry of international drug approvals against the CGRP pathway, and I'm going to walk you through a number of points relating to that in my presentation today. So I'm going to start with a few key points about migraine to give a context for CGRP, and that's picking up on a number of the things that Peter said. I'm going to explain what CGRP is, do my best to do that, and how it fits in with what we think might be happening in migraine. I'm going to explain how the different CGRP pathway blocking drugs work, answer a few questions that often get asked, but of course we're going to have a Q&A session as well to go through much more of that and do our best to answer your questions today. Think about some of the next steps with CGRP and a few moments looking beyond CGRP. So as you heard from Professor Goadsby, migraine is complex. Attacks have many symptoms and they involve several structures inside and outside the brain. We can think of migraine as a condition of many layers, and lots of different factors are combining together, such as genetics, risk factors, daily stressors, that under the right conditions can trigger an attack. And CGRP, or calcitonin gene-related peptide, is one of those layers that is likely a key player in driving migraine and driving that sensitivity that can occur. So what is CGRP? CGRP is a type of small protein called a neuropeptide, and it's found at many different sites that are important for pain and for other symptoms, such as the trigeminal nerve. This image here shows a cross-section of the human trigeminal ganglion, and you can see those bright purple areas, which are actually individual nerve cells completely packed full of individual copies of the CGRP protein. There are so many of them, you can't see them individually. So these nerve cells contain lots of this CGRP protein. And we know that as well as being produced in these nerve cells, CGRP is able to modulate the activity of those nerve cells. It kind of acts a bit like a dimmer, where it's able to dial up the activity of nerve cells. So what is happening in those pathways in the brain is that in response to a stimulus, CGRP is released from a nerve cell to act on a nearby receiving cell, dialing up the activity of that cell by producing a series of chemical messengers within the cell. And it's these mechanisms that are contributing to the sensation of pain. Cell signaling events like this are a normal part of everyday bodily functions. They're happening without us knowing all the time, and they're typically these multi-step events where proteins are passing messages on from one to another, a bit like passing a baton in a relay race. One of the key proteins that's part of that relay race is the CGRP receptor, and that is controlling how CGRP is working. So after CGRP is released from that cell, it makes contact with a matched receptor on that nearby cell to produce these signals. So that's just a different type of protein. And the analogy I'm using here is that of CGRP being a baseball, and the baseball glove, the CGRP receptor, is catching that CGRP on that receiving cell to be able to pass on those signals. And that's happening normally all the time. But what seems to be the case is that in migraine, this system is somehow overactive. We don't understand every aspect of this, but the CGRP system seems to be overactive. There is perhaps more CGRP driving sensitivity, producing more of these signals and contributing to migraine symptoms. But what does a CGRP receptor actually look like? What does a receptor actually look like? So this short video here is showing in blue there a receptor that's embedded in the membrane of the cell, and along comes CGRP, and it's able to engage with that receptor. So that's the CGRP, the baseball, being caught by that receptor, the glove. That's then able to trigger the interaction of other proteins in the cell, creating this chain of events that's ultimately controlling the activity of that nerve cell. And what we know is that the CGRP pathway blocking drugs act in different ways to dampen those signals, to normalize those signals, and turn overactive CGRP signaling into a more normal level of CGRP signaling. So how exactly do they work? So I'm going to categorize this into three different parts, firstly starting with the CGRP antibody strategy. So what I mean here are the drugs that are designed as antibodies to recognize the CGRP protein itself, and these are galcanezumab, Emgality, fremonezumab, Ajovy, and eptinezumab, Vyepti. These are given by self-injection under the skin monthly or quarterly, or intravenous injection 3 monthly in clinic, and they're used for migraine prevention. And they're used in different ways depending on exactly which the drug is, but they all work in a similar way. So essentially, they are able to specifically recognize the CGRP protein. They bind to that CGRP protein, they mop it up, acting like a sponge, meaning that that CGRP is not able to act on its receptor, reducing the number of signals that are sent. So it's stopping that CGRP from producing that signaling by binding to it. The next strategy is a small molecule antagonist strategy. So what am I referring to? I'm referring to these particular drugs here. Zavegepant, Zavpret, Atogepant, Equipta, Ubrogepant, Ubrelvy, and Rimegepant, Nurtec. So the so-called Gepant class of drugs. These are the ones that can be taken either as a tablet or an oral disintegrating tablet, or one of them is a nasal spray. And they can be used either to abort an attack when it comes on, so as an acute treatment, or they can be used for prevention, depending on the drug. And these act in this way. They act essentially like a stopper. They're able to be caught by that CGRP receptor glove in a similar way to CGRP, but they sit there, they block access of CGRP to the receptor, so they're like a stopper in the receptor, preventing CGRP from transmitting its signals. The final strategy is the receptor antibody strategy. There is only one of these drugs, and that's irenicimab or Aimovig. This is an antibody, but instead of binding to CGRP, it binds to the CGRP receptor. And it also acts like a stopper. So it's binding to that receptor in a different way, blocking access to CGRP being able to bind to that receptor. This is used as a self-injection under the skin monthly for migraine prevention. So essentially, they are all acting in some way to reduce those amount of signals that are sent by CGRP, either acting as a stopper to the receptor or acting like a sponge to mop up CGRP. And I would really, really highly recommend the Migraine Foundation website for finding out some more information about the drugs themselves. This details what's available in New Zealand, how each medicine is taken, what's the funding status of that, and we'll hear more about this later on as well. But this is a really well-crafted, evidence-informed source of information, and I highly recommend it. So I'll now move on just to a few questions, and we'll of course cover more later. But some people ask whether there is any way to predict whether an anti-CGRP medication will work for them. I cannot give you good news. Unfortunately, we're not yet in a position to have any clarity around what might be able to predict whether you will respond or not. And although there are CGRP blood tests out there in research, these are not reliable and can't be used to know whether you would be able to respond to one of these medications or not. So unfortunately, it is a bit of trial and error, and I know you will have gone through this a lot with other medications, but people are working hard on this to really see whether we might be able to predict who will respond. If you could choose out of the ones that I've talked about, which one would you try if you could try any of them? And my answer to that is really to try what you are able to access. Since we don't know who will respond and to which drug, you should try what you're able to access and what you would prefer. So, for example, if you had a choice between taking a tablet or a self-injection, some people would absolutely prefer to take a tablet because they don't like injections. However, others might actually prefer to do a self-injection once a month and not have to remember to take a tablet every day. So there's a lot of personal choice here, and having that conversation with your physician to work out what is the best option for you. What if you've tried Emgality and it didn't work? And that's the truth. For some people, it's life-changing, but it doesn't work for everybody. So it didn't work. Why didn't it work? There's a lot of potential reasons, and you heard from Professor Goadsby the complexity of migraine. There is a lot going on. One of the potential reasons could be that because CGRP is so densely packed into the neurons, there are so many molecules of it, we might not be able to mop up enough in every patient that it's able to then dampen that signaling. And I refer back to sort of the layered cake and how migraine is a multifaceted condition with many contributing layers. Everyone is different, and there's a good chance that perhaps for you, other factors are involved. But if you've tried it and it didn't work, is there any point trying an alternative? And if so, what should that be? So if you are able to access an alternative CGRP blocking drug, then it may be worth considering trying an alternative. There is some international evidence suggesting that people who didn't respond to one type of CGRP pathway medication do respond to a different one. We don't understand why, but that is the case. And Professor Goadsby can, I'm sure, talk more to that in Q&A if need be. But which should you try? Well, if you've tried an antibody to CGRP itself, then it might be worth trying something against the receptor instead, because that is a slightly different mechanism of action, and it's targeting that pathway in a different way. So I think it will be becoming clear to you that we don't have all the answers yet, even for the CGRP pathway drugs. And actually, there are still likely to be further opportunities to reduce CGRP signals in migraine. One way that people are looking at this is to layer different CGRP pathway drugs together. So it might be that you are taking Emgality monthly, say, and that's hugely reduced your attacks, and it's hugely reduced the severity of those attacks, but you still do get attacks. There is some evidence that you could then potentially add a gepant, one of the receptor blocking drugs, as an acute medication to abort that attack. So there are some possibilities that we might be able to layer those therapies on top of each other for better effect. CGRP acts in many different parts of the brain. I've focused on one part of the nervous system, trigeminal nerve, but there are lots of different cell types that CGRP could be active on, and it might be that we could do better by targeting more cell types in different locations. As an example, should we be trying to access sites deeper in the brain? Might that be more effective? We don't yet know. We could also think about from a drug discovery perspective, all of the many different types of ways that you can actually target receptors and target CGRP. So I talked about antibodies and small molecules, but there are all sorts of other ways in which we might be able to tackle this. There also might be an additional CGRP receptor that looks slightly different to the one I've described. It could be that this is acting as an escape route, so when the other one is blocked, CGRP is still able to produce signals that way. And I think it's really important to know that all of these and many more are subjects of active consideration and active research. We can also think beyond CGRP. In fact, there are many other opportunities to intervene in migraine pathways. So picking up on where Professor Goadsby sort of ended, pain is a protective mechanism. And so we need a multi-component system as a fail-safe, which means there's lots of different things involved, which means there's lots of different ways in which we can tackle this. And so I've talked about CGRP as an example of one type of protein called a neuropeptide, but cells contain a whole soup of these. They contain many different neuropeptides and substances other than CGRP that are able to modulate the activity of cells in different ways. PACAP, pituitary adenylate cyclase activating polypeptide, is an example of one of these other types of proteins that is being actively pursued as an alternative target for migraine prevention. And it might interest you to know that here in New Zealand, there is research going on the global stage, looking at CGRP, looking at PACAP, understanding how they work at a molecular level. In my lab, we collaborate globally with other academic groups, with clinical groups, and with the pharmaceutical industry to better understand these treatments and to move forward in a positive direction. There are also major global initiatives to better understand migraine. I had the privilege of being part of this group, along with Professor Goadsby, trying to formulate headache research priorities globally for the coming decade. And it's platforms like this that give us the framework to move forward with more research to develop better treatments. So I will close by saying the future is looking bright for better understanding and treatment of migraine, which is unfortunately cut off on the screen despite all best efforts. Thank you.
Could I invite Debbie and Peter to come up to the lovely chairs, please? And I have the questions that have been submitted, and I have a lot of questions that have been submitted online. But I think following on from Debbie, let's just focus on the CGRP to start with. One of the questions that we've had is whether CGRP is similar to the other oral preventives that many of us have tried. So if the other oral preventives were told that after 6 to 12 months we should come off them and see whether we need to continue taking them. What's the case for these drugs in terms of how long do we need to take them for? Is this a thing that we'll need to take for the rest of our lives if they work for us?
I think I should defer to Peter to, not that I'm wishing to pass the buck, but he is more qualified as a clinician to answer that.
Not qualified enough to turn the microphone on. So the question is how long to take a medicine? Well, it's a little bit of an individual thing. Okay, it's pretty clear from what's happened so far that these treatments are not curative. So there's 3 groups have looked at this: the Italians, the Swiss, and the Germans, and their governments insisted that everyone come off treatments at 12 months. And about 4 out of 5 people who come off a treatment at 12 months will have their attacks come back. almost all of them will respond if you put them back on the medicine. So if you've been taking this medicine for 12 months and you feel lucky, then you could stop, and you have a 1 out of 5 chance that you'll be well, and a 4 out of 5 chance that you won't be. So you have to decide how lucky you feel, because there's no actual medical reason to stop, to say that. The problem then becomes what you do in the medium term. We have quite a cohort of people now who've been on these medicines for 7 years, 6 or 7 years, and they do quite well, and they function normally, and they don't want to come off the treatments, and there's nothing long-term has emerged. So there'll be many things that determine that. If you're paying for it, for example, you might want to try to feel lucky, because if it's expensive, that's of course part of the problem. There's no medical reason to stop that we've seen so far, and the canaries have been down the shaft now for 7 years. Is that what you wanted?
I mean, I think I'll also just pick up on the fact that these are different. They are different drugs to the other oral preventives that you might have tried in the past. And so how long you therefore need to try one for to know whether it works. What do you think, Peter? Would you say it's about 3 months? Where are people starting to potentially notice an effect if it is going to work for them?
Yeah, that's a good point. How long? So again, Italians have done some very nice. It's a 16-centre. They've got a number of centres in the headache centres in Italy which collaborate to club together for this sort of information. And 2/3 of people who are going to respond will respond within 3 months. Of the other third, and what happened was the government insisted they continue, that everyone had to stay on the same thing for 6 months. Of the third who don't respond, half of those will respond by the 6th month, and the other half won't respond at all. So probably, if you want to be sure that you pick up everybody, there's a pretty substantial group who take the second 3 months to respond. So we're erring on the side of having people treat for 6 months before taking a decision. The UK government guidance is you should evaluate the treatment at 3 months and see if you're heading in the right direction. I think if you're in the position to take it for 6 months, then you'd be pretty safe that you're either going to get an effect or not.
And following on to that, we've had these drugs for some years now, and questions people always ask about side effects. What are the long-term effects? We have all these other oral medications that cause a lot of side effects. So what is the deal with these medicines?
I haven't seen any. The problem with long-term side effect reporting is you start to get random noise because stuff happens to people over years. Okay. The systematic thing that emerged with arenimab and has emerged with atogepant is about 10, maybe 15% of people will get constipation. They won't like it, and that'll be that. That's emerged. After that, there's nothing systematic that's emerged. I'm aware of reports of some people having some hair loss. Poor them, I say, as I put my cap on in winter. No, I don't mean to be trivial. I mean, I know hair loss is bad. But there's such a range of symptomatologies. I think it's remarkable how few things are being reported in any systematic sort of way. So I think people are watching, and again, there are a lot of people there are a lot of canaries down the shaft already testing it out for you. And if there's a big problem arises, no one's going to keep it as a secret.
And I think compared to the traditional oral preventives, these are extremely well tolerated.
Yeah, I think that's been the big thing. It's bad enough to live with migraine, but living with losing your mind on topiramate is a whole other. The side effects range is pretty bad. You know, you must have been to a doctor who said you have a choice between being tired on a beta blocker, or maybe passing out, or having dry mouth, or sleepiness in the morning on some tricyclic, or losing weight and losing your mind on topiramate. You know, there's such a range of side effects that can be. The data in the US are that only 15% of people who start on a preventive will still be on it at 12 months, and substantially that is because of adverse events. So you're absolutely right.
Which is a distinct contrast to what we've been seeing with the CGRP pathway as a class.
Another thing that we often find with the oral migraine preventives is that effectiveness can wane over time. Is this something that we see with these new drugs?
Well, we see it with a small group. I think maybe 15% will have some effect that wanes. I'm more struck by how prolonged the effects are. The biggest challenge we have in our clinic, I do have NHS, the UK government, CGRP clinic. The biggest problem we have is getting people to stop because they don't get side effects. The effect doesn't wane, and they like being well, unsurprisingly, and so they'll want to continue, and that means the clinic just grows and the administration is not exactly falling over themselves with the idea that the clinical load is growing. But there's a lot of people who are doing very well, very happy, they go back to work. And I constantly remind my colleagues and anyone who's interested in, when they go back to work, that means they pay tax. And guess what? That's a good thing. I don't know any government in the world. That's not true. The Irish government apparently doesn't want tax, is not worried about tax at the moment because they've got some bonus from tech. But apart from the Irish government, only the Irish government would not tax. But every other government wants tax. But really, you put people back to being well, and that's valuable for everybody.
In terms of who can take VLT, what's the evidence around taking it in young people and children, or any of the CGRP meds?
Well, there's no indication for any of the CGRPs in children or adolescents. That said, there was at the Migraine Trust meeting about 2 months ago the first report of a randomised, properly done placebo-controlled trial, like a standard trial, in children down to the age of 6 using fremonizumab that was positive. Extraordinary, really. Paediatric studies are really hard to do, and it was clearly positive. So I think that if you look at from an evidential perspective, it's not surprising. It's likely that all of the drugs will work in children and adolescents. I wouldn't rush to use it in prepubescent children, I have to say that, because I don't think that's a growth and development phase. But you look at 16, 17-year-old who's well on their post-puberty, they're well on the way to getting a license and finding some party on the weekend to either take drugs or alcohol, becoming adults, so to speak, that's what they think. And they've got disabling migraine. I think that's going to be a thing. And so the evidence has just come out, and it's a very nicely done study, I have to say.
One of the other things about the antibodies, like the fremonizumab and Emgality, is that people can develop antibodies against them. What does that mean? Is it common, and does that cause any problem with treatment?
I don't know the data that well, but I do believe that in most people they're not neutralizing, and so even if you do develop an antibody, it's not going to reduce the effectiveness. Would that be your understanding?
Right. Yeah. The titers of these antibodies, there are two sorts. You get an antibody that doesn't have an effect, and an antibody that's called neutralizing, as Professor Hay says. And the titers, the amount of the antibody is quite small, because these antibodies are not particularly immunogenic. The antibody making folks have been spending a lot of time working out how to make things that don't irritate the body. They've done a very good job.
So following on from that, is there any research about use of these types of medicine in autoimmune conditions, and is there any issue with that?
I'm not familiar with any particular trials or anything looking at that.
But in clinical practice, you haven't found that to be a contraindication?
No.
Or no?
Well, the important thing is we understand why. An antibody is like a Y. There's the top bit, the two top bits are called the FAB end. It's what interacts with something, and the bottom end is the bit, you might say, the metabolism and interaction with the immune system end. And there's a part of it in the middle of the Y called the FC end, and that's been deliberately altered molecularly not to interact with the immune system, as in doesn't interact with the immune system. So these antibodies are an example of what's called immunopharmacology, using the immune system to do pharmacology that Professor Hay was describing. They don't have an interaction with the immune system. That's just not a thing. because we understand how to get rid of that. And that's why we don't see any opportunistic infections. There's no interaction problem with other antibodies. The amount is trivial. You have grams of antibody in your body at any one time, grams in your blood. And look, the doses we're talking about. You're talking about from Emgality, it's 120 milligrams, thousandths of a gram, or the 140 for Arenumab and 225. They're trivial amounts of antibody that you take, and you've got grams of it going around your blood. So they're remarkably good. The chemistry is really well understood. When you showed that, I thought that video was pretty cool, actually. The fact you can see exactly how these things work, it's fantastic.
Yeah, and that research is just so enlightening in helping us see this and then, do better.
Sometimes, just talking about the injections, people struggle to take that exactly every 28 days. What would you say about, can you shorten it or lengthen it if that's a problem?
Sure. I mean, that's what the rules are. That's how the clinical trials are done, because clinical trials have to be systematic. One of the things I say to audiences like yours, if you get the opportunity to get in a clinical trial, for God's sake, go in it. I mean, don't expect everyone else to do your work. So I'm going to say that straight up. Go in it when you can, because it's important. And the reason it's important, particularly placebo-controlled trials and controlled trials and blinded trials are important, is because they convince governments. Governments don't want to believe anything because they don't want to have to pay for anything. But if you have properly done trials, then they have to sort of sit back, and you've had your group have taken advantage of the fact that there's evidence and beaten the government up with them. So if you get if you're ever advocating for these things, advocate for things that are going to support you at the end of the day. Well done clinical trials, and I think that that's terribly important.
I mean, it's just important that it's regular. I think with any medication, taking it regularly is important, but it's a little bit like our chronic versus episodic half of 30 argument, and the trials are done at 28, and that's what we need to advocate. But if it was 29, if it was 30, I don't think that's going to make a major difference.
You look around the room. Everyone doesn't look the same. Not to say anyone looks too weird, but I travel on buses in London. There's a lot of interesting, people are different. So some people will be tall and some are short, and we use 28 days because that's a rule, but there'll be some people who get away with 30 days and some people might need 21 days and some people might need 35. And we haven't fully learnt yet how to use these medicines. One of the things about breaking the rules is if you in a government system, is the government can get a little excited when that happens. I think they'll get a little bit flexible. But if you're finding that you can wait for 35 days, we'll just wait for 35 days. It's not naughty. It's absolutely fine.
And often people with migraine are on other medications, particularly maybe other oral preventers, and then you might try one of these new ones and see if it works. Is there any problems with interactions with other medications in general?
I actually am not completely familiar with the interaction data, but what I would say is that there's really good evidence that you can gradually stop taking those others, that actually the number of medicines you need to take is far, far fewer, which will then help avoid any of those potential things.
And specifically, people with migraine often have coexisting depression or anxiety. Do these work with people with coexisting mood disorders? Yes, in a word. There's good evidence for that. That you can be, they won't make you necessarily any happier, but they'll stop your migraine, and that's a good thing.
Which might make you a lot happier.
Yeah, in the generality. Yeah, no, I was being trivial about that, but they don't seem to have antidepressant effects as such. For the GPANs, the only medicines you have to be concerned about are antifungal agents and antiretroviral agents and verapamil and grapefruit juice from memory. That covered the list. So you don't have to admit to being on a fungal agent, but what it does is it increases it changes the metabolism.
Yes, so things like this, the GPANTs, the liver is really important for processing those, and so there are some other things that are also processed by the liver, and that's what is referring to in terms of that just might be the odd thing that you can't take together because they will influence how much of the drug there is in the blood.
But in contrast, the monoclonal antibodies like Emgality are not excreted through the liver or the kidney, so you wouldn't expect to be that a problem.
They're processed differently.
In terms of the new treatments, you talked about the anti-PACAP drug and the new trial that's just come through. Do we have any idea about whether these might work for people with the anti-PACAP drugs might work for people who haven't had access with the anti-CGRP medicine, or is it too early?
That is part of the plan.
That is part of the plan.
It's not known.
No, it's too early to say. I would say that's definitely something that we would hope for. If we think about the underlying biology, there's lots of research going in to sort of understand exactly how PACAP works, how CGRP works, what's similar, what's different, and it does seem that they are not dependent on one another, which suggests that that those who haven't responded to a CGRP therapy might respond to a PACAP therapy, but it is very early days and only that one clinical study reported so far.
And yes, one clinical study, but in your experience, what do you think would be the time frame from now, if it all goes well? How soon we might get one of these new drugs?
Phase 3 clinical studies are long. They require a relatively large number of patients. It takes time to analyse all the data properly. I'm not sure exactly what the time frame would be.
I'd be surprised if it was under 5 years.
Right, and then we'd have to wait.
Because governments then spend about a year looking at the data as a whole. I mean, this is a very involved system.
They have to be as sure as they can that they're going to be safe. So they scrutinise the data very, very carefully, and that unfortunately does take a lot of time.
You should know that in the development of the CGRPs, a couple of the medicines died in this what Professor Hayes referring to, toxicology. You never hear from them because they didn't pass muster in terms of being safe. Well, governments want drugs that you can effectively do something really stupid with, like almost take the whole packet and it doesn't make any difference. Because there are a couple of these drugs, one called calcitonin, the other one didn't even get a name, it's called 3207. They both died in toxicology, had liver enzyme problems. People are very, very, rightly, governments are very, very concerned not to be spraying around anything that's going to have a problem, because migraine, particularly migraine, this is such a common problem, you could do a lot of damage very fast.
When you're talking about the prodrome, some people can recognise when those prodromal symptoms are coming on before you get the headache. What's the utility of actually taking a medication at that point? Can you abort it?
Yes. There's one recent randomised controlled trial with the GPANT, which is not licensed here yet, maybe will, called ubrogepant, where people took either the placebo or the ubrogepant, what's called a crossover study, when they had their premonitory symptoms like light sensitivity or yawning or concentration problems, for example, or dizziness. And they stopped they didn't get headache, they stopped headache, but they also improved those symptoms. It's published at the end of last year, and it's really caused people to sort of stop and think, wow, maybe we should be treating things a lot earlier. That doesn't work for triptans, by the by. So this is it's a new way. It's a bit of a new wave of thinking about how to use these medicines.
It doesn't work for triptans. About non-steroidals?
Well, that's a good question. My impression is that that can be useful for non-steroidals, but it's not. It's not systematically being studied. So you take everything with a grain of salt, apart from the things that you can prove. It'll be interesting to study with non-steroidals. The problem with studying non-steroidals is they're cheap and they're old, and getting anyone to fund a study of non-steroidals, good luck.
Yeah. And, okay, I've got one more question. I'm going to move to something a little bit that you talked about. Is migraine the same, about what's pain, what's the nature of migraine? Is migraine the same as other pain in the body? Can you use techniques to distract yourself like you do for other sorts of chronic pain?
I'll defer to you to answer that.
Yeah, I mean, is it like pain in other parts of the body? Yes and no, depending on what's generating the pain in the other part of the body. I don't think it's like putting your hand on a fire at all. I think that's what's going on. Can you take advantage of body systems which are designed to reduce pain perception so you can get on with things? And yeah, there's neuromodulation devices that do that seem to plug into, there's one you can strap around your arm that seem to plug into systems that we have to control pain so you can do something else. The sort of classic thing where you get an injury but you march on because you need to. So that's a thing. It's not crazy either, but there's good biology behind it.
And they're just such interconnected systems, I think, that we can do one thing and it talks to another part of the body, and this is all happening and behind the scenes, as it were.
We're just out of time and there's lots more questions. So we do have an opportunity after the break to be talking to Peter and Kelvin again. So we'll get to some more of those questions. So now I just want to thank you both for your presentations. We have a little gift for you to say thank you. And this is in our theme of what triggers a migraine and what doesn't. So we have some special chocolates from New Zealand for you to enjoy without any risk of having an attack.
Thanks.
So we'll have morning tea outside in the foyer there, and those of you online will get back here at about 11:25. Thank you.